Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Motivated Property Podcast. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This week's show, we are talking about a recent article that came out. This was back on the 16th of September, talking about climate change and the impacts on the Australian property market. All right, so there are a couple of articles out there. The one that I've got in front of me is from 9 News, but I saw one from 7 News. There was a bit of a thing on some of the mainstream media in the evening shows. Really, the crux of it is talking about how 1 million homes effectively will become uninsurable by 2050 if things continue down this road of climate change, right? And so obviously the fact of the matter is, if a property can't get insured, it's going to be very hard to get debt or mortgage against that particular property. And therefore, this is going to cause some really negative impacts across the property market, right? And that's fundamentally the crux of the conversation. Now, before we get into this topic, guys, I think there is a little bit of, there's a bit for us to sort of unpack here. It is a fairly loaded topic. Now, one thing I also want to say before I dive into this is obviously also very contentious, right? In the sense that, there are many people out there who, believe in climate change, many people who don't believe in climate change. Unfortunately, this is a topic that's been politicized quite a bit over the recent years. And obviously, the fact that we are in a bit of a culture war at the moment, it's obviously making it very difficult to really understand what's going on, right? So with that said, I do want to talk about this with a little bit of respect and, a little bit of responsibility here, considering the fact that it is something that obviously is very big if it plays out the way that the media is portraying it, right? So I guess that's kind of one thing to say before we start. Now, secondly, there's been many people who've sent me this article over the last week or so, and really, with concern, right? And I really want to kind of speak to that concern as well, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a property podcast, right? So really, we talk about property, investment, business, all that sort of stuff here. There is an argument that if this is correct, this is obviously going to be some bad news long term. However, like I said, I want to kind of spend a little bit of time and really kind of break this down, right? Now, with that said, I think firstly, let's take this on face value, right? If, for example, we are living in a world in 2050, 25 years, where half of, the coastline around the country is uninsurable, that is going to be a fairly big problem when it comes, long-term in the property market, right? And again, we've got to keep in context sentiment, right? We have a market as a sentiment-based market. So really what that means is if people are confident, they spend more money. If they're not confident, they don't spend as much money. And so again, if people have this fear, or there's an inherent fear that if they are to buy an asset, let's just say it's $1 million property on the coast somewhere, and they can't get insurance because the sea levels are rising and the oceans are going to come and sort of wipe out your property, that's obviously going to create a lot of negative sentiment, right? It's going to create a lot of fear. And in doing so, that can obviously cause some negative impacts when it comes to property. With that said, we still need shelter, right? So how the government ends up adapting to that, we're not too sure. Obviously, this is all, crystal ball conversation. But look, at the end of the day, we've just got to be really clear at the fact that if this is the future and if this is the outcome that's going to happen, the reality is, because Australia is obviously very much a coastal country, we're going to have to start looking at developing cities that are not on the coast, right? And that really, I guess, kind of is the short answer to that. Now, the fact of the matter is, with the way Australia looks geographically, obviously we can't really live in the middle of the country, right? I mean, we've got desert for the most part. And obviously, as you look at an actual map, and I'm talking an aerial map, we can really only live where it's somewhat green, right? Or actually physically on the coastline. So if, for example, the coastline is going to be ruled out because of climate change, when you look at a map, we can only really live around the kind of the southern and the edges of the country, purely because, again, that's where we can grow food, and all the stuff that we need to ensure that, cities can thrive and survive, right? So again, am I suggesting that tomorrow we just need to pack up our property investment strategy and start, investing in the desert somewhere? No, I'm not saying that, right? However, I would imagine if this is the reality that we're walking into, that's probably going to have to be somewhere in the government's plan, essentially relocating a lot of these cities away from the coastlines. Yes, that would mean that we need to start thinking about decommissioning, freeways and roads and bridges and all the huge amount of money and infrastructure that we've spent over the last couple hundred years here in the country. But it would also mean that we need rapid infrastructure spending elsewhere. Just to be clear, government decisions and government policy does play a massive role in property, all right? And I can't understate this enough. And at the end of the day, one of the mechanics that we're using to help benefit our clients and obviously help our clients, make more money than the averages is by looking at government decisions and investing near and benefiting from those government decisions. So let me give you an example. If the government says, hey, look, we're going to spend, $2 billion building a big, beautiful stadium in Burswood, well, that kind of tells you we will want to start buying properties around Burswood, all right? Because obviously more money's going in there. You're going to have the footy, you're going to have concerts, you're going to be able to walk there. And then what ends up happening is Burswood's prices lift. You've got all the surrounding suburbs, their prices lift the following years, and that's what's called the ripple effect. And the property market essentially ripples out from that huge cash injection in that infrastructure spending. So if, for example, and I'm just going to use Perth and Brisbane as the example here, being on the west and the east coast, if both Perth and Brisbane, if they believe that we're going to be underwater in 50 years, right, and I am being very blunt when I say that, and I am kind of overcooking that comment, but let's just bear with me for a second. If they truly do believe that both Perth and Brisbane are going to be underwater, well, we're going to have to start relocating the city and start building cities inland so that, again, when Perth and Brisbane are underwater, people still have somewhere to live. They've still got shelter. We've still got schools. We've still got hospitals. We've still got all the things that we would need in order for our cities to thrive. Now, again, I just want to make one more highlighted comment to the article here. But the other thing they're talking about here is about 1 million homes. So I would imagine that those 1 million homes would be directly on the water. So again, if you're thinking, 2-3 suburbs away from the coast, from the wording of this article as it is today, it's seeming like they're not only talking about you, they're talking about the houses that are directly adjacent to the coastline and close to bodies of water and rivers and things like that, right? So with that said, I think as a part of this conversation, we just kind of need to be aware that, there is some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't just sort of doom and gloom and this is just the end of the property market and all of a sudden we're all screwed and have to think about investing in other things. At the end of the day, from the wording of this article and really what they're talking about here, we're talking about 1 million homes out of the, 8 million homes we've got around the country. It does seem like we're talking, purely coastline and around bodies of water. Having said that, as most of you who've been paying attention over the last couple of decades of this conversation of climate change, it was global warming, then it was global cooling. Part of the problem that we have, it's based on modeling. Now, part of the problem with modeling, it's kind of our best guesswork, right? So at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be gospel, what's going to happen. However, this could cascade in, say, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, where they're like, oh no, it's now going to be 2 million homes or 3 million homes, and it's going to, and it could essentially get bigger. And that's obviously something that we don't really have much awareness of. Now, with all that said, this is sort of where I guess this show might take a slight turn, because I think, unfortunately, for most people, we're still really unsure about climate change and really what that actually means, right? And I kind of alluded to it before. In the 70s, we were talking about, global cooling. Then when I was in school and high school, it was all about global warming. Now it's called climate change because we're still kind of not too sure. Because again, a lot of these models, there's a lot of inaccuracies and there's a lot of assumptions in here, all right? And so what I want to do is actually just talk about climate change as a whole, right? Now, before I get into this topic, obviously I'm not a scientist. I'm purely a professional investor. And when it comes to this particular science, I have no idea. The problem that we've got is in one side of the column, or one side of the aisle, you've got all these scientists who think that climate change is the worst thing and it's going to completely kill us all. On the other side, you've also got a bunch of scientists who believe it's purely fabricated as a means of controlling the population, right? Now, the fact of the matter is, I'm not a scientist. I haven't studied, climate science or anything like that. So I'm only using purely, really what I can kind of see online and what sort of makes sense to me, as well as my own anecdotal sort of, personal problem solving skills and the research that I've done, right? So that's kind of really, I guess, sort of where this conversation is going to go. Now, the other thing I'd just say before I get into this is, unfortunately, climate change has become politicized. Now, there's a problem in that. And when things get politicized, it means that by default, half of the population just doesn't buy into it. All right. And, remove, climate change, think about abortions, think about immigration, think about, private versus public funding, think about the left versus right, think about vaccines. All of these topics, unfortunately, as soon as they get politicized, it basically gives half the population permission to completely disregard it and think that it's absolute nonsense. And unfortunately, as most of you guys have been paying attention over the last couple of weeks, we are well and truly deep in a culture war right now, right? And we're in a culture war that is probably deeper and darker than I think it's been in my lifetime. But the fact that, you've got one side of the political spectrum completely doesn't buy into climate change in this narrative. You've got the other half of the political spectrum that think that this is going to be, completely apocalyptic for us. The fact that this is political kind of tells me that we don't like it. I guess really what I'm saying here, the fact that it becomes political, to me, it takes the power away from it, right? To me, it kind of screams and seems like you're kind of giving people permission to just completely not buy into it and just completely disregard it, right? And this is part of the problem when shit gets politicized. And again, insert whatever thing is politicized. Half people love it, half people hate it, half people believe in it, half people don't. And, we're now seeing a situation where it seems like we're just having another tug of war with our futures at stake if this is actually the truth. And to me, that's kind of crazy. And in fact, this is probably a really bad place for us to be if this actually is real and actually is as bad as what they say. All right. So that's, I guess, kind of, I want to put that, political topic. I want to put that there. Right now, in line with doing my own research on climate change, like I said, I'm a licensed broker and real estate agent and investor. I mean, I have zero expertise when it comes to climate change. All I've got is my own research, right? And so, with the use of AI and deep research nowadays, as well as obviously the different things you can find on Google and studies and different pieces of information, I guess what I wanted to do was come up with an objective view of really what climate change is, what it means, is it real, what are the impacts, and fundamentally a place to stand when it comes to if this is something that you as a listener want to believe. Now, again, I say that on the basis that most of our clients here are capitalists. So I would say that most of the people listening to this show are probably not on the left side of the spectrum who really believe and want to champion climate change. Most of the listeners that I've kind of seen and talked to completely just don't believe in climate change. They think the whole thing is just rubbish. At the same time, we've also got to consider that most of our clients also work in the mines here, right? So for most of our clients who work in the mines, obviously, we've got heavy diesel machinery. We've got, a shitload of, power and energy being pulled out of the ground by the people listening to this show. I've had multiple conversations over the years. In fact, I've probably had this conversation 100 times over the last, decade with our clients. 99% of them believe that climate change is absolute rubbish and it's not real, and they just completely don't buy into it. So I guess what I'm really saying here is that's kind of the people who are very likely listening to this show right now in this episode. Now, again, I just want to be clear, and I don't want us to, I don't want to be irresponsible by having this conversation the way I'm going to have it. But I also think that, that there is an element of, the research that I've done and what I want to sort of talk to you guys about. I haven't heard or seen anyone that can refute these facts and can sort of talk against this. All I really kind of hear is just propaganda, right? Now, the other part to kind of say before I get into this info, in line with obviously everything being politicized, unfortunately, I'm now living in a world, and I had this conversation with my team the other day, and it was actually about this podcast and how to have this conversation, because I don't want this to take away from the good work that my team does, and I don't want me to come across as some crazy person who doesn't think things through and just buys into the latest bullshit. However, I don't trust the media. I really, really don't nowadays. And obviously COVID, and what we kind of saw during COVID and how powerful, the big pharmaceutical companies were at implementing, policy in Victoria and Western Australia in terms of lockdowns. I have a serious problem with the words that come from our mainstream media. In line with that, I also don't trust our government. I don't. And again, there's study and case study after case study after case study and examples of where the government is literally just blatantly lying to our faces for their own benefit, right? I'm now sitting in a point, and look, potentially a bit of a crossroads here, where I'm trying to represent this in a very professional manner, but at the same time, I kind of don't believe anything that they're really saying. And this is kind of really where I'm struggling to really reconcile this and have a responsible conversation about this without sounding like an absolute Fruit Loop, right? So I just want to kind of put that there before we get into this. Now, in line with that, and I guess let's get stuck into it. So really, what I did with ChatGPT, all right? So this was going back a couple of months ago. And this is, again, having a bit of a debate with somebody about climate change. The way it stands for me at the moment, I 100% believe that the climate changes, and I believe in climate change. I absolutely do, right? And just please don't confuse my words or mix this up. I 100% believe that climate change is a problem for the human species. However, I am very skeptical that humans are 100% the cause, and the humans nowadays are the be-all and end-all when it comes to the impacts of climate change. That's where I kind of that's where I sort of become very skeptical and don't necessarily believe the narrative. Now, what I did with ChatGPT is I asked it a question, and the question, in fact, let me bring it up. All right, what I basically asked it was, and this is a chain where I was asking it to sort of do for and against, but basically what I said was, can you now please summarize the 10 best arguments for the climate change narrative and the 10 best arguments against the climate change narrative using all the research, all the data you can find online, basically a for and against, right? And this is essentially what it kind of said to me, right? So, and I'm going to kind of lay this out and sort of talk through each one of these. Now, firstly, the first argument for climate change and the climate change narrative is the fact that the global average temperatures have risen approximately 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial levels, right? Now, again, I don't necessarily know if that is true or false, or if we can even argue against that. And one thing that I would say here, and this is something that I do kind of buy into with that point, the way that we produce, the way that we manufacture, the way that human beings pollute is completely unsustainable. And part of the problem with climate change, like I said, it's been politicized. You talk about it, people just either believe it or don't believe it. And again, it takes the importance away from it if it gets politicized. But there was a guy by the name of Eric Weinstein, and he was on a podcast many years ago, and he said something pretty profound, and I've thought about this ever since. If we remove the term climate change and we insert pollution, no one has a problem. If we say climate change is such a problem and we've got to change this and change that and change that, as soon as we say climate change, half the people just don't buy into it and the argument's done. However, if we remove the polarizing term of climate change that's been politicized and we insert pollution, and we say that the way that humans are polluting, the way that we're producing, manufacturing, and the industrial pollution that's impacting the planet, that is a problem, I'm all in. I think that we need to stop polluting. I think we really do need to review our entire supply chains of everything from sourcing the materials, producing the materials, getting materials into the market use, having the lifespan of that particular material, and then the end of life use. We need to overhaul almost every industrial chain known to man. We need to stop polluting. We need to be a lot more sustainable. We need to be recycling more. We need to stop polluting the freaking oceans. We need to stop deforesting, parts of the globe. That's something that I absolutely do agree with. Having said that, the problem with saying that the temperatures have risen by 1.2 degrees since the pre-industrial times, what we're doing is we're looking at a very small window of an extraordinarily long lifespan. And so, again, I can see scientists on one side fighting for this. I can see scientists on the other side completely poking holes in it because we're looking at a very small window of a very long lifespan. Now, the fact of the matter is, the climate has changed constantly for billions of years. We go through ice ages, we go through heat waves, there's things like solar flares from the sun. There are a magnitude of things. I mean, even when we have a supervolcano go off, a supervolcano pumps billions and billions and billions of particles of CO2 into the atmosphere, warms the globe for literally years, and that can cause famines. I mean, that can literally block the sun for years on end, basically end all farming and wipe us all out, and that's literally just from a supervolcano. So again, to assume that it's purely due to humans, this is one of the things that I really struggle to buy into unless someone has some better arguments or a better conversation to have here. But again, I don't think that just because it's risen by 1.2 degrees that we just need to blame humans and go and hamstring our own economy to get ourselves to net zero, right? So that's the first argument for climate change. The second argument is the raising CO2 levels and greenhouse gas levels. So the CO2 levels are now 422 parts per million, and that's the highest in 800,000 years. And again, the climate alarmists, the ones who are for climate change and for the message, they're saying that this is really, really bad because this is going to warm up and it's going to make the Earth uninhabitable. Now, when I've done a little bit of my own research, there are two periods that we've got ice cores from. One was the Jurassic period, where CO2 topped over 1,000 parts per million. Then we've got the Triassic period with 2,000 parts per million. So that's essentially basically quadruple what the current parts per million levels are. Now, in both of those times, the Earth was extraordinarily lush, thriving, and we had thousands of species roaming the globe. So again, just because CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere doesn't necessarily translate straight to doom for humanity, right? There is an argument that obviously, plant life, they absorb CO2. That's what they use for oxygen. So there are parts of the globe at the moment, particularly in places like Canada, where because of the increased CO2 levels, plants are also growing and thriving, particularly trees and bushes and things like that are growing and thriving at a faster rate. And when it comes to things like deforestation, forests are growing back faster than what they were planning. So again, this is one of those topics that I've seen been thrown around in Parliament with people, fighting for and against. The fact of the matter is, there's been multiple periods throughout history where there's been, 4 to 5 times more carbon in the atmosphere. The planet was still thriving with life, right? Again, I'm not a scientist, but from the research that I've done, CO2 and increasing CO2 is not the end of the world for the human species. So that's the second point, the arguments for climate change. Number 3, melting ice caps and rising sea levels. So Arctic ice has decreased by nearly 13% per decade by 1979. So that's essentially around 50%, right? So half of the ice in the Arctic has essentially melted into the oceans. Now, what that also says is that sea levels have also risen by over 27 centimeters in the past ocean, threatening coastal regions. Now, this is, I think, part of where this article is really coming from, in the fact that when you've got, for example, somewhere like Antarctica, right? Antarctica is obviously a massive island with a shitload of ice on top of it. Now, if any of those have done an experiment, and I did this in science class, but if you get a glass of water or 2 glasses of water, if you put ice into it, obviously the way that the ice floats, there's only a little small piece that you can see above the water. Most of the ice is underneath the water. So that's kind of where the ice sort of floats at the top. Now, as that ice melts, the ice itself has already displaced the water. So what that means is as the ice melts, the water level doesn't increase. It stays the exact same. Right now, the question is why? Is because the bulk of that ice, the mass of the ice that's underneath the surface of the water, it's already moved and displaced all the ice for its weight. That's obviously the buoyancy. Now, the argument that they're talking about here and the fact that the ice caps are melting is not talking about the ice and the icebergs that are floating in the ocean. It's talking about the ice that's sitting on top of the land in Antarctica that hasn't actually displaced the water. Now, as the global temperatures rise, so as, for example, we increase this carbon, it creates this insulation around the Earth's atmosphere. It means that a lot of the heat coming in from the sun can't actually escape, and all of the heat coming from volcanoes, the Earth's crust, obviously the fact we've got a shitload of lava underneath our feet, under the mantle, a lot of that heat can't actually escape, and it's creating like a bit of a pressure cooker here. All of the ice and the ice caps start melting and then pouring into the oceans, and then they obviously increase the ocean's levels. So that argument I can definitely understand, right? And if that, again, is completely the truth, then I can absolutely see how, the coastal regions, particularly on, around bodies of water, rivers and the oceans, I can see how more mass in the oceans, obviously higher and lower tides, I can see how that might cause, more volatility on the coastlines. So that one, that actually makes sense to me. The next one's the point number 4. So there is an increased frequency of extreme weather events. So more increased heat waves, floods, droughts, hurricanes, cyclones, we call them over here. And so again, if we've got more water and not ice because it's been melted, if we've got more water floating around our atmosphere, that means that there's more absorption into the clouds. Clouds get bigger, there's more rainfall, and then overall, our weather events are more extreme. And again, that can cause some problems. Particularly in north of Australia, we've got cyclones. That can obviously cause, more problems up there. If we've got more water getting pumped down during the cyclone, if the winds are stronger, that can obviously cause more damage and therefore harder to insure over time. So that, again, that completely makes sense to me. However, the problem that I have with the narrative that we have more extreme weather events has to do with something called direct energy weapons, right? Now, again, I want to be responsible when I say this. There have been people that have come out and claimed that the Maui bushfires were, it wasn't a natural event. There are people that have come out and said that the most recent Texas floods were not a natural event. It's due to seed clouding and the fact that, the government has been clouding seeds, and that's how they've done things in Dubai and the UAE for many years when they've turned it from a desert into a thriving city. And so there is also an argument around the use of direct energy weapons. Now, what I'm essentially talking about here are and again, I'm going to sound like an absolute crazy nutter here, but there have been people that have come out, whistleblowers that have come out and said that there are certain governments around the world that have been investing over the last couple of decades on creating, let's just say, devices that can actually cause natural disasters, right? So again, there was one podcast that I watched recently on the Sean Ryan show, for those who've watched Sean Ryan, talking about direct energy weapons that are based in Antarctica that can cause pinpoint earthquakes. And that particular person was talking about how, they actually, caused the Christchurch earthquakes. Again, I'm not sure if I believe it. When they talk about the Maui fires getting, done by lasers from satellites, this is a bit of a hard one for me. And the reason why this is a hard one is because, again, I saw multiple videos online with, lasers kind of coming down. It could have been fake, could be AI. And then you look at the comments and people are like, oh man, this is bullshit. It's all fake. You can't have lasers. It's, this is sci-fi stuff, X, Y, and Z. However, when I was in the Navy over 10 years ago, we had lasers on our ships. And that was a mechanism of the ship's defense. When there's missiles coming in, you can shoot it with a laser, and it basically neutralizes the threat as it's coming in. So once again, this is kind of where, in my own anecdotal experience, this is where sci-fi meets reality. That was over 10 years ago when I was in the Navy, right? And these were systems that were not only at use, but they were tried, tested, and they'd been using them for years. So to sit here and say that the government doesn't have, things like lasers in terms of, direct energy weapons, to me, with what I've known, what I've seen, I'd say that's a very naive perspective. And so part of the problem when we're looking at this conversation of for climate change, having an increased frequency of extreme weather events, in my mind now, and again, with my skepticism of the mainstream media and the government, my question is, out of these extreme weather events that are happening more commonly, what is a legit weather event and what is human fabrication? That's, I guess, kind of my concern, and why I personally, I question that. All right, and that's probably one of the things that I'm a little bit skeptical on. Number 5, ocean acidification. All right, so the ocean absorbs around 25% of the CO2 emissions, leading to acidification that threatens marine and coastal reefs and shellfish. Again, guys, I'm completely against pollution. I think we actually absolutely should stop pollution. We need to look after our marine life. In fact, if our seas die, we die. That's pretty evident. Having said that, there is also a study that I did look here. And this was from a geologist talking about how 90% of the CO2 comes from the oceans, not cars and factories and human production. So again, when they say, the ocean's absorbing 25%, and that's obviously acidifying the ocean. When I listened to this podcast with this geologist, he's talking about how 90% of the carbon comes from the ocean. Again, this is one of those things that I'm struggling to understand what's right and what's wrong. Not a scientist. I'm not too sure. I'll let you guys make with that whatever you will. Number 6, scientific consensus. So 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is primarily caused by human activities. Again, I don't buy into that. Only reason being, I think it is far more credible that the globe has gone through major ice ages, heat waves. It's done that throughout time without humans and without human intervention. The idea that 90% of climate scientists completely agree that it's primary and it's only caused by humans, from what I've seen and what I understand, from what I've studied in high school and things like that. Again, I'm not a scientist. I struggle to believe that. Then the question is, well, how come that 97% of climate scientists do that? Well, at the end of the day, they're scientists, they're people, they can be bought. When we understand, and when you see, kind of what happened during COVID, and the use of vaccines and the fact that you had all these scientists come out and saying that this is absolutely legitimate in all these studies, and the fact that we can trust these bodies because they're scientists that X, Y, and Z, and the fact that it was all fabricated, it was all bullshit, and it was literally all just done for these huge pharmaceutical companies to come and be able to sell vaccines to every single person around the globe and line their pockets with billions and billions of dollars. That tells me that science can absolutely be corrupted. And again, I'm not saying that these guys are corrupt. What I am saying is I have a hard time believing, with the history of the planet and the different levels of CO2 and carbon and all that sort of stuff that in ice cores over time, I personally struggle to believe that climate change in this narrative is 100% caused by humans. I really struggle believing that. But again, I'll leave that with what you will. Point 7 is loss of biodiversity. And again, that's the fact that, many species will become extinct. Again, bad news. We don't want that. And that's something that I think no matter what is and will happen. I guess part of the argument against this one is the fact that that's also happened throughout history. I mean, look, dinosaurs aren't real. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. Dinosaurs are extinct. There's been many phases throughout history where there have been certain species of animals. They're all extinct. When we talk about, negative global events, so if we talk about things like supervolcanoes and solar flares, if those things happen, guys, and I hope in our lifetime and my kids' and grandkids' lifetimes that absolutely does not happen. If it does, understand that most of the global population will be wiped out pretty quickly, right? But again, these are global events that we cannot control. When this stuff happens, you've also got to understand that most of the other species around the world will also go extinct. And that again is part of the problem. So yeah, point 7, loss of biodiversity, understand that. And yeah, I agree with that. However, it's going to happen regardless. The economic impact of inaction, right? So point 8 is talking about the fact that, if we don't handle this will cause many more economic problems in the future. Again, completely agree with that. I think regardless, we're staring down the barrel of that no matter what. Now, with that said, ironically, when we talk about this climate change article that came out, right, part of the problem that and this is, I guess, kind of partly where my skepticism comes from. This article was released, I believe, 2 days before Anthony Albanese announced the new $5 billion net zero fund that'll accelerate Australia's industrial decarbonisation. So again, when I say that I'm skeptical about the media and I'm skeptical about the government, I guess I want to give you guys the justice and sort of defend my position and explain this. Now, let's do a little hypothetical here. Let's say hypothetically, we have a government that is a socialist government, right? Now, as a socialist government, what are the hallmarks of a socialist government? We see high taxation, right? Why? Because we've got to provide more more public schooling, more public healthcare, more public infrastructure. There's more public, and really what it means is the government is forced to expand and provide more services to the people for free through tax revenue. So that is essentially the hallmark of what we would see in a socialist environment or a socialist government. Now, that being the case, what that means is there is an inherent incentive for the government to want to increase taxes and expand the services and what they're essentially doing for the people. Now, my problem with climate change, and this has been sort of my problem from day one, and I have voiced this to listeners who've been listening to this show for quite some time, I have no problem with the conversation around pollution and reducing pollution. No problems at all. I'm there, and I own land. Like I've got a farm down south. I want to make sure that we look after this land and give a better, healthier, planet to my kids in our future. Right? I'm very much on that side of the fence. However, any time that I can see the government using a crisis or what they call a crisis as a means of increasing their size and increasing taxes, now I become very skeptical. And again, call me crazy, but this is kind of communicating to me that this is, again, part of the socialist playbook. Look at COVID. There's a pandemic. There is fear. The government is the one that provides the solution through this vaccine. They also dictate things like lockdowns, right? So they essentially tighten the screws and make things extraordinarily hard and then give you one solution. And that one solution is something that you've now got to start sacrificing, whether it's freedoms or money or whatever the case is, in order to then get yourself free and out of that. And again, this is very much the socialist playbook. Now, the fact that this article went like wildfire on the 16th of September, and then on the 18th of September, Albanese then announces his new $5 billion plan of net zero to then target and combat climate change. It seems a little bit too convenient for my liking. And I'm not saying that this is a complete setup and it's fake and, we need to just ignore, the government. I'm not suggesting that. And please don't assume that that's what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is this timing and looking at the socialist playbook and looking at the timing of these two pieces of information, I am now skeptical that this is actually the reality versus is this now the excuse that this particular government can increase taxes, start doing things in the name of this crisis and then, essentially bloat itself and make more money. And, that's how the story ends up going. Right. So, like I said, guys, I just wanted to kind of lay that out in terms of, seeing the economic impact when it comes to climate change. Now, number 9.9 here of the pros for climate change is the fact that obviously there's been observable changes in things like animal migration, plant bloomings, ecosystem disruptions. And again, I completely agree with that. That's something that we are going to see as the climate does change. However, if we go back, say, 5,000 years ago and look at the previous million years and the variability of the climate, that also happened with heat waves and ice ages. I mean, look, it doesn't take a genius to remember back in the movie of Ice Age, right? Most of us have seen Ice Age, particularly those who've got kids. I'm on freaking repeat at my house nowadays. But even just the whole idea of that movie is the fact that the animals are migrating. Why? Because there's an ice age, right? So like this is kind of goes part and parcel with the long-term trends of the globe regardless, not just what humans are doing to it, right? And again, that's part of my skepticism. Now, number 5 is talking about the success of emission reduction policies in countries like Sweden, Costa Rica. They've reduced their emissions and growing their economies, providing sustainable policies. And again, I don't necessarily know if that's a pro for climate change. What I think that's more of a pro of is we can reduce pollution. And again, I completely agree with that. right? We should be looking at doing things smarter. We should be looking at doing things more sustainably. I just don't see how batteries are going to do that, right? And producing alternate types of energy systems that aren't actually sustainable long term due to replacement life cycles and disposable, like the disposable life cycles of those things, particularly things like solar panels, wind turbines, all that sort of stuff. But again, I do believe that we should be reducing pollution and we should stop polluting. So, like I said, guys, that kind of wraps up the pros for climate change, and then obviously my skepticism or my queries against those pros. Now I want to talk to you guys about the arguments against climate change and the reason why people are particularly skeptical about this. Number one, the climate has always changed naturally. All right. So again, that's been my main point this whole time. So we've got enough data from core samples to know that throughout history, the planet, due to its natural effects, has had massive ups and downs, massive waves when it comes to global temperatures. Those waves have been extremes on the ends. So again, when we go through heat waves, like the actual surface of the globe is uninhabitable, right? We'd have to be living underground or literally, in refrigerators in order to survive. That is natural and normal when we have things like solar flares every 12,000 years. At the same time, when we go through things like ice ages, the Earth freezes, right? And so again, we turn into the movie The Ice Age, where the majority of the globe turns into literally ice cubes. We need to be heating ourselves and living in basically heaters. So the fact of the matter is, these waves have been happening throughout time, regardless of humans. So again, the whole idea that 97% of climate scientists believe that it's mainly human impact, I personally don't buy into that, just from obviously the stuff that I've said. Number two, climate models are inaccurate. Critics argue that many of the climate models overpredict or underpredict certain things, based on the models and the algorithms they're using. This is part of the problem. When we went to the 70s, and I mentioned this before, it was all about global cooling. Then the 80s and 90s, when I was in school, in the 2000s, it was all about global warming. Today they've had to change it, and it's now called climate change because they don't really know if it's warming or cooling, right? And so again, this is part of the problem with these models. The other thing with the models as well is they're also very short term. They don't look at the long term waves; they're looking at short term waves. So again, if we're talking about, and this is part of the whole argument against the fact that the global temperature has risen by 1.2 since pre-industrial levels. The global temperature has also declined over the last 25 years, and we're also producing more than the start of the pre-industrial levels. So the fact of the matter is, the idea that we're now in this global warming phase, the fact that the global temperature has actually declined over the last 25 years, again, it just shows that these climate models are actually very inaccurate. It's scientists using their best guesswork, and now we're making huge billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar decisions about our economy and about the future of energy based on inaccurate models. So again, I can sort of understand that point. Number three, CO2 is essential for life. CO2 is necessary for photosynthesis. High levels have contributed to global greening in some areas, and that's what I was talking to you guys about before, right? There are many places throughout the world, particularly the Amazon and Canada, where there's been a lot of deforestation, and those forests have been growing back much faster than predicted because of the increase of CO2. So again, it is essential for life. Without CO2, we're all dead because we can't make plants, and then the plants make oxygen, we breathe oxygen, we're cooked. Number four, sun and cosmic influences. So changes in solar radiations, that's things like solar flares. Cosmic ray cycles also influence the Earth's climate, and some argue these are underestimated by the mainstream media. Again, if we assume that this is the socialist playbook at work right now, then they're obviously going to be ignoring the fact that, solar flares, supervolcanoes, that kind of stuff really happens without us. And so take that with what you will. Extreme weather data is inconclusive. So part of point number 5 here is saying some studies suggest while extreme weather events has increased, actual incidence hasn't changed significantly once the data is normalized for population growth and economic development. So again, not too sure. Economic costs of climate policies. So transitioning to renewable energy and imposing carbon taxes can harm developing economies and increase poverty. Now, this is probably one that I do want to expand on. Now, there is a podcaster and clinical psychologist in the US called Jordan Peterson. I like Jordan Peterson. He's probably one of the voices that my wife and I listen to on long car rides, and I do really like what he's got to say. Now, one of the debates that I heard him talk about climate change was really talking about how climate change is really a Western problem, and the reason why it's a Western problem is because people in the West, because we've got levels of wealth here, and we're not there are parts of our economy that aren't just stuck in this survival mode. We have the ability to actually pause, appreciate life, and then look into the future and obviously think about things like climate change. I can promise you guys, people in Africa who live on $2 a day do not give a shit about climate change. Why? Because they are stuck in survival. Now, Jordan Peterson's argument, and this is an argument that I can see that I can see the credit in. If we actually want to deal with climate change at the level and the seriousness that it deserves, we need to be getting the cheapest possible energy to the most poor people around the world and raise their living standards as fast as we can. So that means more oil, more coal. We need to essentially just give them the cheapest levels of energy to rise to increase their living standards. If we can get the majority of the world out of poverty and we can get the majority of the world into some form of affluence, you might find the rest of the world might actually give a shit about climate change, and we can all handle this as a globe. Now, again, a part of the problem when it comes to the economic costs. See, Albanese is talking about spending $5 billion on essentially getting us to a point of net zero. And that means Australia as a whole, we would be carbon neutral. My argument is we're already carbon neutral. From the amount of carbon that Australia industry produces versus the amount of trees that we have in the country already, we're already carbon neutral. Canada is already carbon neutral. Brazil is already carbon neutral. Countries with a huge amount of forests are already carbon neutral based on the amount of carbon that's getting pumped and sucked out of the atmosphere versus what our industry is producing. So if that's the case, and if what I just said was correct, based on the study I've done, and again, I'm not a scientist, so take it with a pinch of salt, do your own research. But if what I've just said is correct, and we're already carbon neutral because of the amount of trees versus what we're actually producing as a country, then spending $5 billion to go and, I guess economically, shoot ourselves in the foot to go and change our chains, our supply chains and production chains to get things to become battery operated and X, Y, and Z, and let's just say that future was actually realistic, and I've got a lot of problems with that, but let's just say it was realistic. Like, I guess the fact of the matter is, globally, Australia produces around 1.5% of the total global carbon emissions. Places like India, China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, you got all these countries that produce like most of the world's carbon. They don't give a shit about climate change. They don't give a shit about net zero. And so we can go and shoot ourselves in the foot economically, revamp all of our supply chains to impact 1.5% of the global emissions. China and India don't give a shit. They're still polluting left, right, and center. This doesn't actually change anything globally. So again, this is where, again, many people, when it comes to the economic cost of what the Albanese government is proposing, that economic cost is so much worse than spending that same amount of money and investing in cheap energy for the poorest parts of the world to bring them up. This is, I guess, kind of where there is a bit of there's a bit of tug of war happening, right? And this is where I think a lot of these policies that the government's trying to implement are absolutely foolish and redundant, all right? And that's, I guess, part of my personal opinion. Now, number 7, natural CO2 sources are larger than human contributions. Oceans, volcanoes, and other natural systems emit far more CO2 than humans, although critics often ignore that fact, right? So again, that's what I was saying before, guys. Super volcanoes in the oceans, they're already producing way more carbon than we do. And there is a part of me that believes that it's part of the human arrogance to think that we're just the be-all and end-all of everything. We're the ones who cause all the problem. We're the ones who can fix all the problem. If we have a super volcano tomorrow, in fact, there was a meme that came out a couple of years ago, and it was about one of the super volcanoes. I believe it was in Greenland, I think, and that could be wrong. But basically, in 2 days, the amount of CO2 emitted from this supervolcano was more than the globe in a 10-year period. So it's like we can go and shoot ourselves in the foot economically, upend all of our supply chains, upend all of our production, upend all of our energy systems, and put in this beautiful new net zero policy that essentially removes wealth from the country. And then the supervolcano can go and, unload itself, and it just undoes all that work. It's like, what the hell's the freaking point if the oceans and the volcanoes are going to do this for us? So again, that's part of the skepticism when it comes to this narrative of climate change. Number 8, manipulation of data and bias. So there have been controversies, similar to the Emailgate campaign in 2009, as well as the fact that many politicians and many scientists have been bought and paid for by industry to produce some kind of report or some kind of study. Again, like my skepticism when it comes to the mainstream media and the government, there is part of me that is also very skeptical of people when they say, trust the science. Read between the lines. Number 9, short-term warming doesn't prove long-term trends. All right. So again, this is saying that, if there is short-term warming that we're afraid of, if you're not looking at the long-term lens over thousands and tens and 20,000 years, again, it is slightly naive to assume that we're the ones who are causing all the problems. And then number 10, climate policies serve political agendas. There we go. Some argue that climate change is being used to justify increased government control, government taxes, and the redistribution of wealth. For example, policies that the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset narratives are trying to implement. So there you have it, folks. Right, number 10 has kind of summarized my exact skepticism when it comes to the idea of climate change. Now, I guess, like I said at the beginning, guys, I wanted to have this conversation in a slightly more responsible manner and not just sort of dismiss this, and I wanted to kind of give it the respect it's due. I also would highly encourage, if anyone in this show disagrees with what I've said, disagrees or has some kind of study or something that they can, dispel part of the conversation from today, I would love to hear it. Let me know. Send me a comment, send me an email, put it in the comment, like send me something. I would love to have a conversation with you. Maybe we can have a conversation on this show and talk about it. And again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert in this. One thing that I am an expert in is understanding how to make money and understanding how important we are as a society and how important government policy is and the effects it has on us making money, right? So that's really, I guess, kind of where my expertise does lie. I'm very interested to keep this conversation going, right? I for those who've been listening to me for a couple of years now, kind of know that I'm not this arrogant, egotistical wanker who thinks I know everything and, what I say is it. I'm very much willing to be wrong here. I'm very much willing for someone to come and give me a counter argument and change my mind. Please change my mind. The fact of the matter is, I often listen to debates because of this. I'm always listening to debates. And I know last episode we were talking about Charlie Kirk and obviously, the impact he had on my life. But, at the end of the day, the reason why I love Charlie Kirk is because he would openly debate people. And the idea is it's getting, a for argument and against argument, let it clash, see what lands, right? And that's where I think, we're missing a lot nowadays. Now, I also want to end this show with the fact that if this is as bad as what they say, we can't just ignore it and we have to do something about it. If this is as existential as they're saying, we can't just let this shit slide and just do nothing about it. Like, we've got to literally do something about this now. And I would say that if it is legit, we've got to take Albanese's net zero policy and we've got to turbocharge that even faster if this is real. However, with the information that I've seen and what we've spoken about today on today's show, I am skeptical. And I'm skeptical for the reasons that I have said, particularly with the timing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, this article came out on the 16th of September, and then Albanese's policy came out on the 18th of September. That timing is a little bit too convenient for my liking. And like I said, I want you guys to do some homework and Google the Socialist Playbook, because you'll see how these are a couple of very important steps from the Socialist Playbook. So without further ado, guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this rant about climate change over the last hour or so. I do appreciate you guys as listeners. And I think what I would say here is, I am personally not really worried about the impacts of climate change on the property market right now. If things change, sure. But for what this article is talking about and for where most of our clients are investing, like I said, guys, I don't think this is really something for us to worry about right now, but time will tell. Thanks for listening.